In 2004 on the PlayStation 2, Capcom released its first game in the action RPG Monster Hunter series, Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter puts the player in the role of a hunter who slays or traps large monsters as part of quests given by the locals in town. The core gameplay loop lets players use monster parts to improve their weapons and armor to fight even stronger monsters. Unlike most JRPGs, the player's stats don't level up through the accumulation of experience points, so equipment was a primary source of improvement. But more importantly, a player's skill in fighting the monsters with their chosen weapon also played an important part in their success as a monster hunter. To actually acquire equipment, players would often have to grind the same monsters several times to get all the parts they need to craft their gear. Eventually, a player would move from low rank to the high rank quests, which featured stronger monsters to procure better parts for even stronger equipment. The specially crafted reinforcement loop of gameplay fighting monsters to wear their skin to fight stronger monsters is what defines the Monster Hunter experience. The secret sauce in this formula is the fact that there were many different types of weapons to choose from, and each weapon was so different that they practically changed the way the player would play the entire game. The weapons had their own attack speeds, movesets, and fun gimmicks, like the classic greatsword's charge attack or the lance with its strong damage mitigating shield to compensate for its slow movement. In addition to the numerous melee blade master options, the game also had ranged selections with their own attack speeds, projectile strength, and defensive options. At its core, Monster Hunter was a game all about fighting carefully designed boss monsters with the player's choice of weapons, equipment, and hunting strategy. The game had a single player component as well as a substantive multiplayer component, allowing hunters to team up with up to 3 other human players to hunt monsters. Capcom also added event quests over time to the game as part of their network features, giving the game more value over time, and these event quests sometimes introduce special equipment into the game along with new challenges. Monster Hunter, along with Resident Evil Outbreak and Monolith, was one of the 3 games that were part of Capcom's network initiative to create a million-unit selling network game. Monster Hunter sold over 1 million copies worldwide, with most of those sales in Japan. In the West, the game released to mostly middling reviews, and it didn't quite capture the appeal it did in Japan. Capcom released an improved version of the game, Monster Hunter G, for the PlayStation 2 in Japan 1 year later in 2005. This expanded version of the game added even more difficult quests with monster subspecies and new monsters to hunt. A new dual sword weapon type, which was imported from the original game's North American version, was also added. Monster Hunter G was also ported to the Sony PSP as Monster Hunter Freedom, and this version of the game was also released in the West. Monster Hunter G and Monster Hunter Freedom had explosive popularity in Japan. Monster Hunter Freedom in particular was very popular on the PSP as people could casually play with each other using the game's ad hoc multiplayer feature during get-togethers. However, the West continued to give the game middling reviews. Part of the reason the game wasn't as popular in the West was that ad hoc in-person multiplayer wasn't as popular in the less population-dense West, and Western gamers favored home consoles and computers over portable gaming devices. The game's steep learning curve with a clear lack of tutorials was also blamed for its somewhat lackluster reception in the West relative to Japan. Capcom released Monster Hunter 2 in 2006 only in Japan. This game added an improved weapon upgrade tree and upgradable armor. Gems were added to the game to customize slotted armor, adding to skills or making available skills stronger, and could be created with monster parts. The game also added a day-night cycle, seasons, and new monsters. Longswords and hunting horns were added as new weapon types for players to hunt with. Monster Hunter 2 was partially ported to the PSP as Monster Hunter Freedom 2, which adapted Monster Hunter 2 to a new single-player campaign. Monster Hunter Freedom 2 was also released worldwide on the PSP. The game had 2 tiers of quests, low rank and high rank, along with elder quests that were geared towards single players with monsters that had lowered hit points. Players could join other players in quests at their rank tier, but were required to reach higher tiers to join players on those quests. Treasure hunting quests were also available to players to help them earn currency to afford items and upgrades. High rank quests from Hunter rank 4 and up were considerably more difficult than the low rank quests, with their difficulty at the level of the G rank missions in Monster Hunter G and Monster Hunter Freedom. Monsters at this rank have new tricks in their movesets, a lot more hit points, and hit like freight trains. But they also drop rarer materials to construct powerful equipment. Also, whereas the low rank missions would give players supplies and start them in camp, high rank dumped players in random areas and supplies would be delivered mid-quest. True to the networking theme of Monster Hunter, free downloadable quests offered by Capcom over time gave players the opportunity to acquire special equipment that wouldn't be obtainable otherwise. Monster Hunter Freedom 2 also featured a training school to teach players how to be better hunters. This school had training quests players could undertake with different loadouts of items and equipment given to them to complete the quests in the game's various fields. This game sold 2.15 million copies worldwide, with 1.7 million of those copies being in Japan as of July 9, 2008. Capcom released the MMORPG Monster Hunter Frontier Online in 2007 in Japan on Windows, the first spin-off to appear on the platform. Later in 2010, this this game was released on the Xbox 360 as Monster Hunter Frontier, where it sold 93,000 copies. The game received expansion packs called Seasons and Forwards that added new locations, armor sets, and monsters. Capcom also released presets to accommodate players on PCs with different hardware specs. In 2013, Capcom released a major update for the game called Monster Hunter Frontier G. That was released in 2013 and 2014 in Japan on the Xbox 360, Windows, PlayStation 3, Wii, and Vita. The update added 10 new monsters, upgraded 21 monsters to the G rank or Master rank, added 150 G-class weapons and armor sets, 30 new skills, 4 new elementals, and new actions for 11 weapon types. The game also had many collaborations with other companies through promotional outfits. Monster Hunter Frontier was only released in Japan and ended service in December 2019. Monster Hunter Freedom 2G was released on the PSP in Japan in 2008 and the rest of the world as Monster Hunter Freedom Unite in 2009 as an even more expanded version of Monster Hunter Freedom 2. There were more monsters, more equipment, and more missions. A feline companion was added to accompany hunters. Rarity 9 and 10 weapons were added to the game, and players could hold 99 of each type of item in their item boxes. Epic hunting quests were added, allowing players to hunt up to 4 monsters in one quest. Weapons could achieve a higher rank of purple sharpness. Rank 7 through 9 quests were added to the Gathering Hall, and DLC quests gave players early options for customizing their felines. Capcom released a demo for this game in the West featuring several quests and about 2 hours of gameplay. They also had some events in the West to further promote it. Monster Hunter Freedom Unite sold like gangbusters in Japan, even managing to outsell Pokemon Diamond. It sold 670,000 copies on its release day and 1 million in its first week of sales. There are no official numbers on American sales, but the game reached 3.8 million total sales as of November 7, 2019. Monster Hunter Freedom Unite was actually the first Monster Hunter game I played. I picked up the game used at GameStop for really cheap, curious about why this game was so popular in Japan. And I really hated this game when I first played it. I played it for 2 hours and got nowhere. Using SNS, the community term for sword and shield, I did a gathering quest in the first map and got destroyed by a Velocidrome, the equivalent of a beginner level mid-boss in any other video game. I didn't know what I was doing and I just wandered around aimlessly, getting bored, gathering things and slaying small monsters. I put the game down for a few days, went on GameFAQs, and read a whole bunch of posts and FAQs geared towards beginners. The next time I turned on the game, I had an entirely different experience. I started experimenting with the different weapons, naturally inclined to go for the faster ones first. And it took a long time for me to finally get to the hammer, since I never thought I'd enjoy using a heavy weapon in a game like this, but I fell in love at first charged smash. I went and smashed that Velocidrome's face until it was seeing stars, and getting my first KO never felt so satisfying. I'll spare you the entire story of my experience with that game, but it ultimately ended a few years later with 700 hours of gameplay completing every quest, DLC event quest, and training quest in the game solo. My main weapon was the hammer, but I got really good at destroying the Tigrex Express with the great sword charges and heavy bowgunning monsters too. When I picked up a PlayStation 3 years later, I immediately obtained an add-on letting me enjoy the game's ad hoc multiplayer online with other people, and it completely opened up an entirely new dimension of fun for the game. Up to that point, 700 hours was the most I had ever played any single game. Needless to say, I was hooked on Monster Hunter, and it quickly became a series I patiently awaited Western releases for ever since. The Monster Hunter Freedom Unite community in the 2000s was pretty funny too. The answer to most questions about how to defeat specific monsters was always, just hit the monster and don't get hit. Flash bombs were seen as a cowardly strategy that made the game too easy. Many hunters would also tell legends of how they would fight ultra-powerful monsters on G-rank naked, and there were a few hunters who would compete to get the fastest quest clear times with specific weapon types. I'm sure you could find a few of those videos on YouTube to this day. Monster Hunter Freedom Unite definitely isn't perfect, and even by late 2000 game standards, it had a lot of jank. I mean, check out the stinky illogical hitbox on this Plesioth hip check. This was the worst offender, but even fighting other monsters in Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, it wasn't uncommon to see them hit you out of visible range. You just get used to it the more you play it and get better at fighting monsters. Before Monster Hunter World, Monster Hunter games balanced healing by making the player go through an exceedingly dumb lengthy animation of drinking a potion and then flexing, which usually gave monsters enough time to simply hit you again and destroy what you recovered. This is one that still annoys me even in modern Monster Hunter games. The Rathalos World Tour that wastes time so that Rathalos can think he looks cool for a few seconds before it gets its face smashed with my hammer. I almost always have a flash bomb ready to knock him out of his flying animation these days, but chasing around the map still demoralizes me, even with fast travel in modern Monster Hunter games. Oh, and while it's on my mind, the hammer still can't cut tails even though the hunting horn can. I have to use a stinky boomerang or switch weapons. And last but definitely not least, the small monsters in Monster Hunter Freedom Unite will get you killed more than the big monsters. The Bullfango are merciless with their charges, and even a stinky monster peck can KO and leave you vulnerable at the absolute absolute worst times. The Vespoid insects are especially dangerous, stinging you while you're waiting in place, charging your epic hunt-ending greatsword charge, inflict paralysis on you, and give the big monster time to destroy you. There's a lot more jank in this game, and to this day people are still making fun videos of Monster Hunter Freedom Unite on YouTube to show it off, but I have other Monster Hunter games to talk about, so... Capcom's next Monster Hunter release was Monster Hunter Tri for the Nintendo Wii in 2009 in Japan and 2010 everywhere else. The game was originally planned for development on the PlayStation 3, but the high cost of developing on that platform ultimately led to the game going to the Wii. Online play for the game was free of charge, and this was the first game to include native voice-over IP capability. This game included free hunts on the local island in the game, along with the traditional guild quests introduced in earlier Monster Hunter games. The biggest new addition in this Monster Hunter game were new underwater environments to fight new and old monsters in. The Gunlance, Hunting Horn, Dual Swords, and Bow weapon types didn't make it into the game, but a new Switch Axe weapon was added to the mix. The weapons that remained in the game got new updates and innovations too. Capcom made an effort to appeal to Western players by including voice chat in the game. There was also a free demo disc available at GameStop for people to try out the game. I don't have much to say about Monster Hunter Tri because I was still busy playing Monster Hunter Freedom Unite when this game released, and I didn't feel like spending more money for a game with less content was worth it, so I never played it. Capcom also released a spin-off Monster Hunter game in Japan on the PSP called Monster Hunter Diary Poka Poka Ido Village, developed surprisingly by From Software and published by Capcom in 2010. It's a cute adventure game that emphasizes village management and style with felines. From Software also developed a sequel to this titled Monster Hunter Diary Poka Poka Ido Village G that released on the PSP a year later in 2011 and was later developed for the Nintendo 3DS in 2015. 10 television shorts called Monster Hunter Diary Giri Giri Ido Village were also produced to promote and help advertise the game. I did pick up Monster Hunter Portable 3rd on the PSP in Japanese in 2010. This game adapted the content from Monster Hunter Tri into a brand new single-player campaign. The game excluded the underwater combat, but brought back some of the weapons that didn't make it into Tri and added new regions, monsters, and a revised feline combat system. I'm not going to spoil this game, but I will say this game's flagship monster is one of my series favorites, and I think it has a really cool introduction too. The game's balance is really wonky though, and I think the reintroduction of weapons that weren't in Tri may have been responsible for that too. They felt shoehorned in without much balance consideration. I remember being able to destroy everything in this game with the bow despite my power weapon being the hammer, which just felt really weird. Yukumo Village is also one of my favorite settings in the Monster Hunter series. It was a fun game that definitely had better graphics and presentation than Monster Hunter Freedom Unite. Definitely less jank, but also less content. Still, I feel like I had fun and got my money's worth out of the game. Capcom also released an HD remaster of this game on the PS3 in Japan in 2011. Unfortunately, the game never saw a Western release though, and I honestly couldn't tell you why because the series seemed to be picking up steam in the West from what I could gather back then. The PSP version got a near-perfect review score from Japan's Famitsu magazine. The game sold 4.8 million copies in Japan by June 2011. Also, in June 2011, Capcom released Monster Hunter Dynamic Hunting worldwide. This is a spin-off Monster Hunter fighting game released on iOS and Android. Two-player multiplayer is possible with Bluetooth, hunts are 3 minutes long, and players need to hunt monsters to unlock access to new monsters. Even though I passed on Monster Hunter Tri, I definitely picked up Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate both on the Nintendo 3DS and the Wii U in 2013, and both versions got extensive playtime from me. In fact, I bought an accessory called the Circle Pad Pro just to be able to play Monster Hunter comfortably on the smaller 3DS, and it got plenty of use from the next 3DS Monster Hunter game too. Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate was pretty much the Monster Hunter Freedom Unite of Monster Hunter 3 in terms of content. The Wii U version of this game was incredibly beautiful relative to the older Monster Hunter games I played, and one of the reasons I loved my Wii U so much. The game had underwater combat, a huge number of monsters from both Monster Hunter Tri, Monster Hunter Portable 3rd, and older games. In addition, the game brought back the G rank that included challenges beyond the high rank from most of the other Monster Hunter titles, and added an online hub the player could visit offline to complete quests solo that would have been required online in Tri. The Japanese version of Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate was Famitsu's 11th game in its 20-year history to receive a perfect score, and the game also got some of the best reviews a Monster Hunter game had ever received from the Western press up to that time, hitting Metascores over 80. Personally, I thought it was a great game. The only things I missed were the training school from Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, which was replaced by multiplayer training quests in 3 Ultimate, which became standard practice in later games. I also missed the difficult solo trainings that did better to teach me how to play the game than the simple weapon tutorials in the games these days. Not that I needed them, because honestly, if you can make it through Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, you can make it through any Monster Hunter game. I wasn't the biggest fan of underwater gameplay in the game either, despite that being the game's major gimmick, but it was entirely possible to avoid a lot of underwater gameplay gameplay for the most part. The switch axe was a fun new weapon to play around with, even if I preferred other weapons. And the Kelby bow was hilariously broken, but extremely fun to toy around with. I did most of the combat solo like I usually do, but I introduced my friend to the series, and we played this game quite a bit. While I didn't clock 700 hours on the title, I was able to get through all of the content in a very satisfying 200 hours spread between the 3DS and Wii U versions of the game over a period of several years. Capcom released its next game, Monster Hunter 4, in Japan with an exclusivity deal with Nintendo on the 3DS platform in 2013. Monster Hunter 4 added three-dimensional movement to the game, with more fluid wall climbing and the ability to jump on and mount monsters. Underwater combat was removed, and monsters were more aware of the terrain, using it to their advantage. Multiple camps unlocked throughout the game, introducing a large cast of NPCs and a longer story than previous entries. Online multiplayer was fully integrated on a handheld for the first time. The game had 14 weapon types overall for players to use, with 2 weapon types, the Insect Glaive and Charge Blade, being new to the game. A guild quest system was used to generate unique equipment for players through quest rewards, and up to 50 guild quests could be saved. Although Monster Hunter 4 was Japan exclusive, its expansion, Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, was released worldwide on February 13 on the 3DS, about 4 months after it was released in Japan. This expansion added the much anticipated G rank to the existing low and high rank quests in the base game, along with new monsters, new weapons and armor, and a souped up Apex mode to monsters at the highest difficulty level, which was really the new gimmick of the game. I have a lot to say about this game, as it is the most special Monster Hunter to me. Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate was easily my favorite Monster Hunter game in the series. The game was loaded with fun content, and I even spent a considerable amount of time with weapons other than the Master Race hammer whilst playing it. I ended up clocking in 4,000 hours on that game across several years. If I wasn't working, I was streaming the game on Twitch, collecting powerful weapons and armor sets for all 14 weapon types, and trying to improve my skills with all the weapons for the Master's Test. I did just about everything I could in the game. All the quests, loads of multiplayer with my viewers, which usually meant a whole lot of dual Furious Rajang level 140 quests, or Jang banging as I like to call it, since I usually went at these quests with a hammer. I also used all the game's weapons to complete the game's ultimate challenge, the Master's Test, with all 14 weapon types at least once on stream. And I made these Master's Test challenges a weekly event on my channel. I wasn't always successful, since I was definitely better with some weapons than others, but I did manage to complete it with all 14 weapon types eventually. And it was an amazing experience I'll probably never forget for the rest of my life. Even if I am bothered by the fact that my fastest clear time on the quest was actually with a greatsword and not a hammer, despite being very suboptimal with the greatsword. All those memories aside, it definitely wasn't a perfect game. While I was glad I didn't have to fight underwater, the Apex mechanic and the way to deal with it by buffing your weapon with a special item really frustrated me, because the dumb buff never lasted long enough for me to actually knock some of the monsters out of their Apex form, which meant I spent a lot of fights being super aggressive when I had the buff, and then just fighting super defensively until I could use the buff again, since it had an annoying cooldown. Sometimes the monsters would just go right back into Apex at the absolute worst times too. Hitting an Apex monster anywhere but their weak point with an unbuffed weapon usually meant your weapon would bounce and give the monster an opportunity to just destroy your hit points. Special consideration went into the game's localization towards the goal of making the game a success in the West, such as the avoidance of memes in localization and including useful information on loading screens instead of story narration, and streamlining game tutorials. Overall sales of the game exceeded 4 million copies in the West and 4.1 million copies in Japan, turning it into a serious influential force not just in Japan but worldwide. And this set the stage for the success of future games in the series. In fact, Sony's Shuhei Yoshida mentioned very recently that Nintendo signing Monster Hunter 4 as a Nintendo exclusive was the scariest moment for Sony. It happened right after Nintendo also dropped the price of the 3DS from the $250 price matching the Vita to just $150. A time I fondly remember because I picked up a 3DS soon after the price drop myself in anticipation of Bravely Default. Monster Hunter 4 wasn't even announced in the West at the time, but I knew it would be coming to the 3DS eventually, so that was just the icing on the cake for me. Nintendo not only managed to outprice Sony's new portable, but it also took the biggest best-selling PSP game in Japan from them. Sony attempted to compete with games like Soul Sacrifice and Freedom Wars on the Vita, but couldn't keep up with the 3DS for the rest of the Vita's generation. Anecdotally, Monster Hunter 4's Nintendo exclusivity might be one of the big reasons Sony actually gave up on the Vita. Capcom released mobile and iOS spin-off Monster Hunter Explorer in 2015 in Japan and 2016 in Canada, which basically just brought the Monster Hunter gameplay to Android and iOS. It featured up to 4-player multiplayer, local or online, and 14 weapon types. Then, Monster Hunter Generations was released on the Nintendo 3DS in 2015 in Japan and the rest of the world in 2016. This game featured a Prowler mode that let players control felines in combat. Armor pieces could now be transformed transformed into new gear through upgrades, and weapon upgrading was streamlined to be more straightforward. Monster Hunter Generations also added hunting arts that were special moves that would charge up through the course of a hunt. But the most radical change to the gameplay were the new hunting styles, which could be selected before hunts that define a player's moveset and sometimes completely transform the way a weapon is used in combat. The guild style was the Monster Hunter standard style. Striker style emphasized and made it easier to use hunter arts, allowing 3 special attacks to be set up. Aerial style let players jump all over the place like maniacs, and the adept style gave players access to powerful counterattacks after successful evasions. The combat system for Monster Hunter Generations was very flashy. The game also had 4 signature monsters to take the place of the usual flagship monsters in past Monster Hunter games, 3 villages from prior titles along with a new one for this title, and deviant monsters, which were monsters from previous games that were mutated and evolved into stronger forms. 2 years later, Capcom released Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, which just added even more content to the game, including a final tier difficulty rank, new quests, some new monsters, and 2 new hunter styles. Valor style, which just adds more gimmicks on top of gimmicks. I mean, lets hunters sheathe their weapon and use abilities to charge a meter that buffs a player and upgrades their moveset. It's a style I find similar to the Japanese martial art of Iaido that emphasizes fast sword draws. The alchemy style lets players mix items in combat to support themselves or the party. I'm just gonna outright say it. I didn't like Monster Hunter Generations and Generations Ultimate that much for a Monster Hunter game. Usually I have fun messing around with different weapons and actually doing all the non-required hunts, of which there were a ton of thanks to this game being a celebration title, including almost all the monsters in the series up to that point. I did have some decent wacky fun using the aerial style with the hammer for a bit, and the monster Mizutsune that the game introduced is another one of my favorite monsters in the series. All in all, I blasted through the game solo at record speed and just never played them ever again afterwards. I still got about 70 hours out of the games, but compared to the usual hundreds of hours of entertainment I get out of most Monster Hunter titles, Generations let me down. I think the hunting styles were too gimmicky and confusing to keep track of with all the changing controls for the weapon when the style was changed too. I just preferred the more straightforward single movesets for each weapon, and yeah, I know guild style exists, but it's boring in Generations. I think Monster Hunter had enough variety in gameplay with 14 weapon types and didn't need the hunting styles to complicate the formula any further. I also think the hunting styles imbalanced the game's difficulty in a way not dissimilar to how I thought Monster Hunter 3 Portable had wonky difficulty. That's just me though. If you love flashy action games, Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate is the Monster Hunter game for you. Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate was actually brought to the Nintendo Switch in HD in 2017 in Japan and 2018 in the rest of the world. The Generations family of Monster Hunter games overall sold 8.2 million units across all platforms by September 2020. Between Monster Hunter Generations and Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, Capcom and Marvelous developed Monster Hunter Stories, which was actually published by Nintendo and released on their 3DS platform in Japan in 2016 and everywhere else in 2017. The gameplay is completely different from Monster Hunter's action RPG focus and plays out more like a turn-based RPG, which is usually more my style when it comes to games. But I wasn't too crazy about this one, as it was made to appeal more to fans of Monster Hunter than fans of JRPGs, and felt more like a monster collector game than the more fully featured JRPGs I'm into. The player is a rider who tames monsters and befriends them. The monsties the player tames are used to explore different environments and overcome stronger monsters that the player can tame in a loop that's a bit similar to how hunters get stronger in the Monster Hunter games. The game's turn-based combat uses a rock-paper-scissors system, and winning combat gives the player experience points and items. In addition to the main story are subquests, which also provide items and experience on completion. The player can equip a greatsword, hammer, hunting horn, or sword and shield, which also determine the skills a player can use in battle. Monster Hunter Stories does take a much more sensitive cooperative approach to the monsters in the series, which are typically maimed, killed, or captured for research in the main Monster Hunter series of games. And that alone probably endears the game more towards some communities than others. The game also got a loose adaptation as an anime called Monster Hunter Stories Ride On and some amiibo figures. Monster Hunter Stories was later released on iOS and Android in 2016 and 2017, and then later for the Nintendo Switch on June 2024. The game sold 140,603 units in its first week of sales in Japan, and was also nominated for several awards at various Game Awards shows in 2017. Right after Monster Hunter Generations, the Monster Hunter series was at a very high point in its popularity among its fans, but there were many things Western fans still wanted from the Monster Hunter series. There were also a lot of potential players interested in the series for its concept and positive word of mouth from their friends. Probably the single biggest ask from Western fans was to put the series on powerful hardware to take advantage of all the modern graphics and performance enhancements the technology could provide to the Monster Hunter experience. And thus, Monster Hunter World was brought to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One worldwide early in 2018 with full online support for the first time. Sony offered their full support to Capcom, and the game's release also boosted PlayStation 4 sales 140,000 units. The game was later released on PC in the same year. Monster Hunter World's online gameplay systems were completely revamped to appeal more to a worldwide audience. Like every new Monster Hunter game, new monsters, weapons, and hubs were added to the game. Monster Hunter's more animated cartoony aesthetics were replaced with photorealistic characters and gameplay. I personally love the changes to things like gathering items and post-potion guzzling animations that were made seamless and a lot more natural. Gone with the numbered zones and the loading screens players had to sit through between traversing them. It was the most seamless Monster Hunter experience, and it was very 3D in the respect that the large open world had loads of verticality with ways to take advantage of that verticality, both by players and monsters. The game had several large downsides for me though. The first was the extraordinarily large size of the maps, which actually causes just about every other problem I have in the game too. Remember the comment I made earlier about Rathalos flying away all the time to new zones? This game was the worst for that. Even with the myriad ways to fast travel, it could take a while to actually get to these monsters. And the second thing is all that bloat added to the game just to give players something to do in the stupidly overlarge maps. A lot of this revolved around collecting special things or finding a needle in a haystack. I didn't mind a little bit of this kind of thing in previous games since the maps were smaller and guides could give better directions to the objectives. But it gets old really fast in World's complex environments. The third is all the research you have to do sometimes just to even encounter a monster or unlock the quests. You just run around finding footprints, food piles, notes, and symbols which give points towards making things doable that were just there from the start in prior Monster Hunter games. The last thing has nothing to do with the maps and is more of an annoyance than a large downside, and for me that's this girl right here, who's more or less glued to you for the entire story. I really miss the girls from past Monster Hunter games. Also, while I get it and realism is more immersive for most people, I really missed all the fun joke weapons and more relaxed cartoonish tone of the past games. And I get it, for every person like me who loves the more anime aesthetics of Monster Hunter and the other games, there's at least two who prefer the photorealistic cutting-edge graphics and more serious, believable tone of the game that realism brings to the setting, which is part of why this game sold 23 million copies as of January 2024, with a mind-blowing 6 million of those copies sold in the game's first 2 weeks on the market. And this is also why it was nominated for and won numerous awards, including Best RPG at the 2018 Game Awards, even if I think Octopath Traveler should have won the award. Anyways, Monster Hunter World got an expansion called Monster Hunter World Iceborne that added the top-tier master rank to the game, new monsters, a new clutch claw mechanic letting players attach to monsters, new maps, a new fast travel system, and several changes to game mechanics that made the game more fun to play in my opinion. But even with all those changes, it didn't necessarily address the bigger problem for me with the large maps. Typical to tradition, Capcom continued to release new monsters and event quests until October 2020 for the game. The Iceborne expansion sold 9.2 million copies as of May 2022. You could say that Capcom, in their earnest effort to appeal to Western gamers, sort of alienated me from the equation with the game's direction, but I by no means hated Monster Hunter World. I got a good 200 hours of satisfying gameplay from World and its Iceborne expansion before I stopped playing it, and heck, they still got my money in the end. They also got my money for their next game, Monster Hunter Rise, but not right away. Monster Hunter Rise was released on the Nintendo Switch in 2021, PC in 2022, and on the Sony and Microsoft platforms in 2023. As Monster Hunter Rise was released on weaker hardware, they were forced to give the game the aesthetics I like in a Monster Hunter game. Monster Hunter Rise was a whole new game with new maps, new monsters, and some new mechanics. The game added some elements from Monster Hunter Generations, giving the weapons some personality without forcing players to choose rigid movesets with the hunter skills. Some weapon skills did feel a little gimmicky for me, but overall I actually liked how the system was implemented in Rise. The wire bugs also served a bit like the clutch claw from Monster Hunter World Iceborne, one of my favorite features from that game. The wire bugs could allow players to emergency dodge, close distance quickly, or perform aerial attacks that could mount large monsters. Wire bugs would recharge over time. In fact, Monster Hunter Rise has great vertical gameplay, and there's some really cool stuff you can do with parkour during the hunts. Monster Hunter Rise also has this weird tower defense like rampage mode I couldn't stand and quickly did as little as I could with the quest types, similar to underwater hunting in Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate for me. Thankfully, Capcom didn't develop these quests further and force people to play them when they released the expansion of the game in 2022. Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak added a new hub to the game along with a new master rank hunting tier, new monsters, stronger equipment, and a new storyline. Gameplay-wise, I think the game was very comparable to World in fun factor, at least for me, but Rise's tighter environment design that meant I wasn't chasing monsters halfway across the world when they'd fly away made the experience much better for me. I like to say Rise is World, but without the large open world maps and the more fun aesthetics I missed from World's emphasis on realism. The weapons also had more creative creative designs in line with what I came to expect from classic Monster Hunter titles. The twins are so much better than World's Guild Girl, although I wasn't too crazy about many of the characters in Sunbreak's new hub town. I got close to 300 hours on Rise before I got sick of grinding monsters that have inflated hit points for minuscule gains to reach the game's final content, which was also my biggest complaint about Sunbreak. Grinding monsters is kind of the point, but it's a lot more fun when I'm doing it to upgrade my equipment than it is to do it just for getting my hunter rank high enough to fight something new. Given that this is a complaint about the later post-game though, I'd say that's not bad for a Monster Hunter game. Monster Hunter Rise lost to Tales of Arise at the Game Awards in the RPG category, but frankly, Shin Megami Tensei 5 should have taken the award that year, and I don't even think that game was nominated. Monster Hunter Rise hit 4 million sales just 3 days after its release, and went on to sell 13 million units as of June 2023, while Sunbreak reached 6 million units in sales by that time. Monster Hunter Rise was the first Monster Hunter game I didn't buy on day one after I fell in love with the series. I bought Rise and Sunbreak many years later on deep discount on PC shortly after Capcom released their last update to Sunbreak, and then blasted through all the content in a little over a month of hitting the game hard. Between the release of Monster Hunter Rise and its Sunbreak expansion, Capcom published a sequel to Monster Hunter Stories called Monster Hunter Stories 2, Wings of Ruin for the Nintendo Switch and PC in 2021. Like the original game, Marvelous helped to develop this game. It was later released for the PS4 in 2024. This game adds a new buddy system to the original turn-based RPG experience that lets the player character be joined by another rider and Monstie. The game sold a very respectable 1.5 million copies as of May 2022. Niantic, the creative minds behind Pokemon Go, published Monster Hunter Now in 2023 on Android and iOS with Capcom's development assistance. Like Pokemon Go, the game is an augmented reality location-based game where players can interact with large and small monsters on the map by tapping on them. The game had 3 million pre-registrations before release and 5 million installations within a week of the release. Capcom stock surged and the game made $14 million in revenue within its first week of release. And finally, Capcom is set to release the next game in their Monster Hunter series, Monster Hunter Wilds, on February 28, 2025 for the PlayStation 5, Windows, and Xbox SS. And I've played it. It's fun. I was able to run around with the hammer and dominate every monster except the flagship in the second demo, which I know I could do if I gave it a few more tries to memorize its moveset, but I want to save some fun for the full game when I'm playing it. I do love the flagship monster though, and I think Capcom is really good at developing flagship monsters for these games that always feel unique and fun to fight no matter how many Monster Hunter games I've played. The game's big gimmick, at least in my opinion, the wound system, is actually really fun and encourages players to target body parts they normally wouldn't target with their damage types. As a hammer user, I typically target a monster's face unless I know I won't get another KO before the battle ends, in which case I'll hit other weak points on a monster if they take more damage from blunt weapons or can be broken for more rewards. But with the wound system, a wound will open up on a monster and exploiting it does extra damage. I can appreciate the variety of strategies this should encourage in the full game to hit parts I normally wouldn't have to think too hard about targeting specifically. But as you may have already guessed, my biggest problem with the game is exactly the same one I already mentioned when I talked about Monster Hunter World, and that's the overlarge size of the map in the demo. I'm sure the other maps will be at least comparable in size if not bigger. It's giving me the bad vibes I had from Monster Hunter World again, chasing monsters way more than I need to, and I can't help but think the game is going to give me the exact same headaches in the exact same ways. All that said, I'm still excited to play the game, but I'm going to do exactly what I did with Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak and just give the game a few years for Capcom to make it a better game with all the service updates, free DLC, and inevitable Monster Hunter Wilds expansion to add what I really care about, the Master Rank, before I buy both games for a cheaper price. I'm sure it'll be a fun game, and I know it's probably all everybody is going to talk about after it releases, at least until Nintendo's April 2nd Direct for the Switch 2. I'm not exactly thrilled to keep a fat stinky 75GB game on my PC's hard drive for more than a month or two anyways once I start playing it, regardless of the quality of the game and how long Capcom plans to support it with scheduled DLC. In addition to the spin-off games I talked about, Monster Hunter received a manga written by Hito Mashima, the creator of the manga Fairy Tail, loosely based on Monster Hunter called Monster Hunter Orage. It also received a book called Monster Hunter Episode, a Hollywood feature film directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, and an animated film subtitled Legends of the Guild, released on Netflix. There's apparently another Monster Hunter movie in production called Monster Hunter 2 as well. Around the time of Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, Capcom has tried telling more detailed stories in these games, but to be honest, I don't pay attention to any of it. So as you can probably imagine, I personally had zero interest in watching movies or reading books based on the game. But if you've watched or read these, share your opinion in the comment section below. I will say the gameplay is almost always on point though, and that is what keeps me coming back for more whenever a new entry is released. Sure, no game is perfect. One thing in just about every Monster Hunter game I've disliked disliked are the overly scripted hunts that you can't shortcut through thanks to the monsters having tons of stages or requiring you to chase through multiple maps before you're able to actually finish the hunts. And the new gimmicks added in Monster Hunter games are always hit or miss for me. Sometimes monsters' hit points balance really funny in multiplayer games that aren't 4-player, and some teams of people will just lock down monsters so hard the fights will literally finish in under a minute if everybody knows what they're doing. You can see this in action on Team Darkside's YouTube channel. Overall though, multiplayer is just a lot of fun, and Monster Hunter is a fantastic bonding game to play with others, whether it's local co-op or online. The thing with Monster Hunter, and I think this is something everybody who has thoroughly played through at least one Monster Hunter game can say, is that as a skill-based game, there will be no Monster Hunter like the first one you play while you're learning all the mechanics. Every Monster Hunter game after that first one will be so much easier because your skill and understanding of the underlying mechanics makes you better at playing the new games. This skill carries over even if you change weapon types, although you will have a period of acclimation with any new weapon you've never used before, as using a new weapon may not usually change a monster's patterns much, but it will usually change the way you attack a monster. And for me, this is why I don't have the same excitement for the series as I used to. 95% of any new Monster Hunter game I play is actually pretty easy for me, while the 5% that's fun and challenging for me are usually the introductory flagship monster hunts between rank tiers, the last single player hunt, or the hunts that are late into the post game in Master or G rank on the expansion. Content that's usually not even in the games for years until after the initial release. And that's mostly because I was battle forged on 700 hours of single player Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, with a bunch of Monster Hunter games in between to keep my skills from getting too dull. Getting good enough to beat the Master's Test with every weapon in Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate even made it so I understand weapons I'm less familiar with well enough to still not fail quests even if I use them in a new Monster Hunter title. Because while the weapons do change a little bit between games, the general themes and strategies for using them will remain largely the same. Also, while the Monster Hunter games always get better with these post-game release updates, the prices of these games go down over time too, until you can ultimately buy a better, more complete Monster Hunter experience for a fraction of the initial cost. So even though the Monster Hunter series is definitely a top 10 action game for me that I could easily recommend to people who enjoy skill-based action games or co-op multiplayer experiences, they aren't really games I'll personally buy on launch day anymore. Many companies have tried to create their own Monster Hunter-like games, but they just can't nail that formula for me despite sharing very similar reinforcement loops and consistent service updates to their content post-game release. My personal favorite Monster Hunter likes are Sony's Soul Sacrifice, the earlier games in Bandai Namco's God Eater franchise that had really cool bullet mechanics, and most recently Granblue Fantasy Relink, but none of those games successfully capture the thrill like Monster Hunter does, and quite frankly, I don't think any developer will ever be able to compete with the near-perfect formula Capcom has iterated on for these games over the years. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.